Ladies and gentlemen, let's begin this evening's program. I invite you to take your seats. We convene this evening at a perilous moment. The dissolution of the Soviet Union was celebrated as, quote, the end of history. But the last several years have shown us that those predictions were, at best, widely inaccurate. At worst, they were naive. We are witnessing a resurgence, not only of domestic discontent, perhaps reminiscent of the Vietnam era, but changes to the global equilibrium that threaten to create a great instability and conflict. We certainly see that now with last week's terror attacks in Israel. We are going to be diving into all of this and more over these next 2 days and traveling all around the world, exploring solutions to complex problems, fashioning together the outline of a 21st century American grand strategy. To begin our summit, it is my pleasure to introduce Ambassador Robert O'Brien, who served as the 27th and most recent National Security Advisor, the U.S. Special Envoy for Hostage Affairs, and is chairman of the Board of Directors of the Richard Nixon Foundation. You'll be hearing extensively from Ambassador O'Brien tomorrow during lunch, and it's my pleasure to introduce him now to talk a bit about what this evening has in store.
I think I just saw Speaker Waltz come in. Well, what a privilege it is for me tonight to introduce two good friends, and we'll hear what they have to say about the world, and it's going to be a great evening. And I'm not going to spend too much time with it. I'm just going to spend like an hour on the introduction. So I'll keep it brief. First, Katie Pavlich. I was on Katie's show on Sunday night. She was very nice to me in the interview, so I'm going to be very nice to her in the introduction. She's a great American. We're Pac-10 colleagues, UCLA and University of Arizona. Unfortunately, the Pac-10 is going away. Hopefully, that's not a theme with America or that sort of thing. But she's a great American out from the West. And I heard about Katie about 10 years ago. I didn't know who she was, and I got a call from a friend of mine, Hugh Hewitt, and a lot of your friends at Hughes. And he said, "There's this great young journalist, Katie Pavlich. You've got to get on her podcast and get to know her." And so I've had a chance to meet with her over the years, and she's a terrific journalist. So whenever she's on Fox, make sure you tune in and put your TiVo or DVR on. And so, Katie, welcome. She'll have I told her to give Mike a very hard time, and she's too nice to do that. But you're in for a real treat with Katie doing the interview tonight. Now, as Secretary Pompeo, I'm not from D.C. I'm from California. I've served back here. I've served back here a few times over the years, 2-year stints. And what I've learned about it in Washington is there's two ways to do an introduction of the great man or the great woman in Washington. The first way is to do the Wikipedia introduction, and it's always long and impressive, and then they come up and speak. The second way is to make it about you, and you talk about your interactions with the great man or the great woman. Now, on the Wikipedia page, Secretary Pompeo's got, first in his class at West Point, the Harvard Law School, DC, Director of the Central Intelligence Agency, Secretary of State, pretty impressive CV. In fact, President Trump, you saw every time Mike was coming over, President Trump would say, Robert, do you know he was number one in his class at West Point? I'd say, yeah, I know that, sir. And so that's a Wikipedia introduction for Secretary Pompeo. Let me talk about me for a moment. And hopefully you get to know Mike a little bit. Now, I had the benefit of working for Mike and working with Mike. And when I worked for Mike, I learned a few things about him, and all good. The first time I was invited back, the Secretary of State has an office that's about the size of this room. I mean, it's gorgeous, it's well-furnished, it's beautiful. But hidden behind the office is his real office where he does work. And it took me a couple months to get invited back to the back office. And I got back there one day to talk about hostages, and I took the position on the hostage affairs that I only reported to Mike, which made me very popular at the State Department. And we'll get to that in a minute, but I used to tell him, I'm not going to clear anything with you. I'm not going to do anything you tell me to do unless Mike Pompeo tells me. And then I realized they were too scared to go up to the 7th floor, and so I kind of get my way. So I went to go get approval from Mike to do something. I walked into his office in the back, and he had his cavalry pennants and some cool things around. But what really impressed me is Mike had his scriptures open, and he had the Old Testament. And in the few moments that he had, and his schedule as Secretary of State is booked every 5 minutes, he had 5 minutes off and he studied his scriptures before he met with me. And I can't tell you what that meant to me, and it gave me the courage to go get my Bible from home and bring it in and put it on my desk in the office. And I'll never forget that, Mike, and that was really impressive. He's a great man of faith. So I finally get the rank of ambassador, and when you're at the State Department, you're flying in the middle seat in economy, and they'll be like flying to Algiers or something to go try and get a hostage out, and they've got you routed on 5 stops, all economy. And I become ambassador, and so I think, well, I'm going to the same place Mike's going this week. He was going to Europe. I'm going to try and get on the Secretary's plane. And so I tell my staff, hey, Mike's going to Central Europe, and I got to do some meetings there. Get me on the plane. I thought that would be kind of cool. And so they get me on the plane. I thought, okay, I've made it. I go out to Andrews. I get on the blue and white, and of course Mike's up in the first in his cabin with the pull-out bed and the desk and the whole thing. And I keep walking to the back of the plane looking for my seat, and I'm all the way in the back with the press. Sorry, Katie, and the DS agents. So I realized I ticked off all the State Department people that I'd been working with by telling them I didn't have to, they weren't the boss of me. And it turns out whoever was in charge of the seating on the plane was the boss of me. And so about halfway through the flight, Mike comes walking back to, the secretary comes walking back to see what's going on with the press and do a little press availability. And he sees me, he goes, what are you doing back here, Ambassador? And, and Mike was instrumental in me getting that rank. And I said, well, this is where they sat me. He said, okay, stay here just a minute. And he goes, I thought, okay, Mike's going to go fix my seat, and he's going to move me up to the front of the plane. And instead, Mike shows up with Susan. And I start to stand up. He goes, no, don't stand up. I just want to show Susan where they sat you. And with that, he turns around and walks back, and Susan, turns around and mouths, I'm sorry. Mike just thought it was pretty funny. But last little vignette I'll tell you, just to give you a flavor of who Mike is. And again, Mike can be a little crusty on the outside. He can be a little tough to work with sometimes. He's a hard charger. He wants success. And one thing I will tell you is that MBS or King Abdullah would have never stood up Mike Pompeo if he flew into town. I can guarantee that because I've been in some of those meetings. You remember what happened in Turkey, Mike, when we had a little problem with our friend President Erdogan. And you just want to be behind Mike is the program. But as tough as he is, there's when you peel away down there, there's a heart of gold. And I've got this isn't public, and so I'm going to have to change. I'm going to be very delicate in how I describe this situation. But I was a hostage envoy, and I had a family member of a hostage who was very insistent on me going to visit a very bad man in a very bad place to negotiate to get her son out. And so I thought, okay, I'm going to do it, and I'll take the risk. I talked to Marie, and Marie said, well, if you think it's okay. And I thought, I'm an American, a diplomat. I'm not an ambassador. I mean, the State Department may only give me the middle seat in economy, but I'm going to get treated well by this bad foreign government. So I went over to the CIA and made plans and had a CIA plane ready and all kinds of arrangements. Of course, I forgot that Mike was director of the CIA and probably knew exactly what I was doing. So I came and told him what I was doing. He said, you're not going there. I said, no, I'm going there. I promised this mother that I'd go try and free her son. He goes, you're not going there. It's too dangerous, too risky. It's not going to happen. And it was the only time I think Mike and I, we agree on just about everything foreign policy-wise. I think it's the only time we've kind of gotten a little bit of an argument. I got a little irritated, and he finally said, yeah, the reason you're not going is because when you don't come home, I'm not picking up the phone and calling your wife. I'm not calling Marie and telling her you're not coming home. And at the time, I thought, well, that's an unfair argument. But it also shows how he feels about his people. So anyway, I finally convinced him to go. So I show up in a third country with a CIA plane supposed to meet me. And the CIA, I said, did you send the letter to this government that I'm coming? They said, yeah, the letter hasn't gone yet, but we're working on it. We'll get the letter out. And so I sit there for about 5 days. The plane's ready to go. And there's no response. And I thought, well, it didn't work out. And they came and said, yeah, we never heard back from that government. And I thought, okay, well, it's too bad. We give it a shot. I told the mother I'd give it my best shot. I went there. it was only like 3 years later after I'd left government that I thought, did they ever send a letter? Or did Pompeo just put the kibosh on the trip? No, I'm not going to ask him because I don't want to know the answer. But I think I know the answer. I think I just sat in this third-party Middle Eastern country for 4 or 5 days, cooling my jets, came back and thought I'd give it a good shot. But the point of that story is that Mike loved the people that worked for him, and he was always there. It didn't matter if you're a career foreign service officer or a political appointee, and what your mission was. He was behind his people, and he wasn't going to let anyone get hurt, or at least he needed to do everything he could on his watch to make sure there was never a Benghazi, to make sure no American was ever taken hostage, to make sure no American diplomat was ever harmed, and that's why people love Mike and Susan. So without further ado, it's my privilege and honor to introduce the 78th Secretary of the State of the United States of America, Mike Pompeo, and the great Katie Pavlich from Fox News.
Well,
just in case I couldn't figure it out.
Yeah, just in case. Well, I just want to be clear that at least the press got on the plane.
Yeah, by the way, that introduction was fantastic, Robert. Thank you. That's very kind. And mostly true.
We'll fact check it tonight. I'm glad to know I'm sitting next to the Secretary rather than in front of you, as said by the Ambassador. Now that the comedy portion of our evening is over, it is a horrible time, but also a perfect time to have you here, given the recent events that we've seen in the Middle East playing out, more specifically what happened on the 50th anniversary of the Yom Kippur War in Israel. Obviously, things have changed in the region, but just from your perspective of where we are, maybe an overview to start out our conversation of how you see things now and in the future.
Thanks, Katie. First of all, thank you to the hosts here for having me here this evening. When we planned this, we thought different circumstances would be upon us. We would have spent 70% of our time talking about Europe and Ukraine and the Chinese Communist Party, and now we are confronted with a situation in the Middle East that is unfathomable and I think sadly was not inevitable, and we'll talk about that too, I'm sure. You know, Robert talked about the fact that I had my Bible open on my desk. It was to the Old Testament. I always want to remind everybody that it's an Old Testament world out there and that there is, in fact, evil. And if October 7th reminds us of nothing else, it is that whatever Panglossian views one wants to have, whether you are on the isolationist libertarian right or on the Rashida Tlaib evil left, that there are bad people that want to change the way that you and I live and are prepared to slit the throats of babies and to rape elderly women and to take hostages. And, you know, Katie, one of the things that already has fallen out of the headline is those days, those hours that we all saw unfold. Now the talk is on to the next things. Are we going to provide assistance to the civilians in Gaza and all of these tactical items? But remember, the best way to encapsulate what happened there is that you had evil walk into the Negev and change the lives of 1,300 families, and you had Iranians behind it, and it was, in fact, the Ayatollah that killed those 30 Americans. And we, Americans, those of us with blue passports here tonight, should never forget that when someone kills an American, there has to be a response from the primary actor. The primary actor here is not the knuckleheads in Hamas. It will not be the artillery rounds that fall from southern Lebanon, from the artillery rounds that ostensibly belong to Hezbollah. It's not Abu Mazen, one of the just most unpleasant human beings I've ever encountered, who loosely presides over Judea and Samaria today. No, this is from Tehran, and it is Tehran that in the end, if one wants to confront this evil, that is the address to which the response must be directed. And I am hopeful that I don't think it's likely, but I am hopeful that the Biden team will come to understand that they will reverse the model that they have had for the 2.5 years, which frankly set the context for what we saw on Saturday. They're not responsible for it, but they enabled the Ayatollah to believe that he could do precisely what he did that day.
So one of the things that has dropped out of the headlines that I find astonishing is exactly what you're discussing, and that is the hostages and the Americans that were killed. So Hamas is now holding hostages, American hostages. They won't say how many there are. And not a lot of people are discussing that. Is that a matter of making sure that the negotiations behind the scenes go according to plan? Or is it a matter of just kind of driving by and going on to the next topic as Americans remain hostage in the worst crisis since the 1970s?
Oh, goodness. Katie, I hope it's the former. That is, I hope this is really brilliant diplomacy. Yeah, but it would be ahistorical for the Biden administration, right? And I don't mean that politically. Remember, there are a bunch of us in this room that when the Biden administration paid $6 billion to get 5 Americans out of Iran, said that this will encourage hostage taking. And we all said they'll go back at this again. But who would have dreamed they would double their inventory in a couple of weeks? Right? Who would have believed? The answer is I would have. Right? These are people who say, well, goodness gracious, at $1 billion per, I can do the math on my GDP. And it's not, I guess that's a little bit clever, but the truth is this is their reality. They had less than $4 billion of foreign exchange reserves when Robert and I left office. They now have $70 billion. This is now a nation that isn't wealthy, but is on the road to being wealthy, and they are feeling their oats, and they're now holding Americans hostage. Katie, you're not quite old enough to remember 1979 when we had hostages held under President Carter, and it took America using all of its might, its appropriate power to get them home. I hope the Biden administration can find a way to do that same thing, and we don't have to wait like we did with those hostages to get them back until we have an inaugural day for a new president.
Yeah, well, I do remember President Reagan coming into office, and they were quickly released as a result of strength on his behalf. You mentioned Iran. The Biden administration continues to deny that they had, quote, direct involvement in what was carried out in Israel 2 weekends ago. Can you explain what direct means and if this is a delusional statement they're making, and why are they making it? Why are they not willing to draw that conclusion when clearly Iran was involved here? And I'm sure we will learn more about whether there was a cyber attack on the border wall that Israel shares with Gaza, and more of the infrastructure and training that they have given, not to mention the money.
Yeah, when I hear Kirby, spokesperson, or the president saying there's no evidence of direct involvement, there is a lot of weight putting on that word direct. My mama would have said that's a lie. I'm a former diplomat, so I'll simply say that's just not true. They were deeply and directly involved in the killing of these Israelis and Americans and the others, in every element of direct. All of the things that they did were things that the United States would do as we prepare to go build out alliances and partners around the world. All the things were the very things the Iranians did to build out Hezbollah, the militias in the Shia militias in Iraq. Remember, on day one of the Biden administration, we had designated the proxies in Yemen, the Houthis, as terrorists. And on day one, they de-designated and said, nope, those folks aren't actually terrorists. All of these things built to today, the Biden administration just simply can't acknowledge this, because once you acknowledge that Iran is the problem, it requires, the American people would require a response. And so you got to tell wolf tales to the American people. And that is deeply dangerous, because I pray that we will give Israel every day, every hour that they need to complete their mission, as they decide the scope and scale of what that mission ought to look like, and we'll provide them the resources and tools to do that. If they are maximally successful and they take out all the Hamas infrastructure and all the senior leadership and begin to circumvent resources and money coming there, Israel is still at risk, because you didn't really solve the primary problem, the problem of the Ayatollah in Iran, where, by the way, we should not forget, they are hosting al-Qaeda's leadership, even as we speak here. And so we know the correct address to solve this problem, and I hope that we have the courage to do what's necessary. And we have the tools. We can do it without starting World War III. All of those things we can spend time on. We know exactly how to do it. It just requires an administration that understands how to use American power in a way that can prevent or at least decrease substantially the likelihood of what we saw on October 7th in someplace else.
Well, President Nixon understood that well, and he said on October 6, 1973, when the Yom Kippur War happened, send them everything that can fly. Now, the Biden administration has put 2,000 troops, U.S. troops, on notice to reportedly deploy to the region. You've seen a number of aircraft carriers moved closer to Israel's coast in the Mediterranean Sea. At the same time, you heard a lot of fluffy rhetoric coming out of President Biden and from Secretary Blinken that all sounds very supportive of Israel. At the same time, they are still funding Iran. 24 hours ago, 12 hours ago, the UN sanctions on Iran's ballistic missile program and their drone program expired, so they now legally can sell and buy those kinds of weapons. So what is your perspective on where this goes from here? And then I have a follow-up about our major non-NATO ally, Qatar.
How this progresses turns in large measure on how and whether the United States will lead. The Israeli leadership knows what needs to be done, and they are quite capable of achieving it. The question is when will we pull the chain? The pressure, I can write Secretary Guterres, the UN Secretary General, I can write his press release for him, no need. I know precisely what it will say. It'll be the same one that comes from Brussels, from the EU leadership. You will see the church, Catholic Church and others, the whole world will watch videos in the coming days and weeks, and they'll be awful because there'll be something that happens where there are civilians that are killed. It is inevitable when one of your primary objectives is to show the world how many of your civilians got killed, right? That's how insane the Iranians are, is that the first thing they want to do when one of their civilians gets killed is run a commercial or get the AP to do their work for them, right? I mean, just terrible. And so the question will turn, in terms of how it proceeds, it will turn on what perception are we able to create in the minds of the Ayatollah, the IRGC leadership, and the president of Iran. What are we able to convince them we're prepared to do? And if the answer is we're going to make sure that the Rafah crossing is open for water to go in, you will have a multi-front conflict. And I don't even just mean in northern Israel or out of Syria or out of the West Bank. I'm talking about Islamabad, Amman, capitals around the world where when there is no price to be paid, the Iranians will, that's the old Southwest Airlines line, they will feel free to move about the cabin. And so in the end, it turns on American leadership, and I pray that Prime Minister Netanyahu and others can convince President Biden to allow them to do what is absolutely necessary.
So I mentioned our major non-NATO ally, Qatar. Hamas leadership does not live in the Gaza Strip. They do not live in the West Bank. They live in billions of dollars in luxury in Qatar, where their people suffer and do their bidding and get themselves killed. They also meet with Iranian officials in Doha, and there's video of them parading themselves out, kissing each other on the cheeks, and I thought it was a really good coordinate for a drone strike. You would know something about that with the killing of Qasem Soleimani. We need more of that. But they're clearly being very bold. And what about Qatar, given our relationship with them and their harboring of these terrorists who just killed 1,300 Israelis and are holding hostage countless more?
So it's a complicated relationship with them. But October 7th changes everything about each of our relationships. Not just in the Middle East, frankly, but it is time for people to decide, like, where are you going to land on this? Are you going to foment this? Are you going to acknowledge that this is okay? Or are you going to just exude the common decency to understand that what took place there is so far out of bounds for how any nation or any actor, hostile actor, non-nation actor, is permitted to act? So, for a long time, the Israelis asked the Qataris to provide money into Gaza, right? At their direction, at their behest. It was the model, right? To keep the lid on in Gaza, you tried to make life better for the people that were living there. It's a shame that the Iranian leadership didn't have the same objective. But we've got to be very clear. It is unacceptable for the leadership of a terror organization to be running around freely anywhere. Last thought, I mean, maybe this expands beyond Qatar and more broadly to the Middle East. So they have a responsibility. The Gulf Arab states leaders have a responsibility to create the space to get this right as well. They have a problem, though, that was created by President Biden, which is that we put them in an awful bind when we are sitting at the table negotiating with the very Iranians that are firing missiles into their country. We put them in a bind when we create a pathway for Iran to get a nuclear weapon that could wipe their countries off the face of the earth. If you sit where they do, you see that as risk, and you do what any rational actor will do, is you try to hedge the risk. So the Gulf Arab states reignite their diplomacy with Iran. They cozy up to the Chinese and conduct military exercises, all things which move them away from the West and the United States, but all things they do in response to being identified as a pariah nation. Right? And this was the elegance of the Abraham Accords. And by the way, credit goes to a lot of people for the Abraham Accords. People say, Mike, you did that. No, it was a huge team. Robert was at the center of it. Jared Kushner, there's a big team. But none of us, and Robert may tell a different story, but none of us dreamed this up. None of us came to office saying, we're going to build the Abraham Accords. What we said were really three things. One, Iran bad. Punish them. Deny them resources and wealth. Two, Israel good. Snuggle up to them. Be their friend, no matter what happens. If this had happened on our watch, it would have taken 4 seconds to hit send for Morgan Ortagus to send a press release saying, we're with Israel. And we would not have had to retract a tweet from our Palestinian office that said, hey, can't we all just get along? Right? So Israel good, Iran bad, and we are not going to let the Palestinians in the West Bank stand in the way of building out greater peace. And that was the thought, and it built. We had fantastic leaders: the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia, the President in the Emirates, the leadership in Bahrain. Amazing people. President Trump. Lots of just took the good Lord putting these people in place, and we finally found the right model that helped them get where they needed to be. And importantly, I'll give you another fact that just ties this all in. It's hard to imagine those countries moving forward without the strike on Qasem Soleimani, the Iranian general that we took out. Well, it wasn't that he was threatening them. He was. It wasn't that it was hard for them to deal with the IRGC and its leadership team. They were. It was like, oh my goodness, these guys will be with us on a bad day. These guys are bold enough that they're prepared to take some risk for their own people to protect something that matters to us. And so that gave them the space that said, if we have a bad day in Bahrain, or we have a bad day in Abu Dhabi or Dubai, President Trump and his team will be with us. And if you're sitting in those capitals today and you're watching that, I promise you, you think if there's a bad day, you're going to get told, oh my gosh, you're a bad actor, and we want nothing to do with you. And the Washington Post will write about Jamal Khashoggi, and we'll be off to the races on our own. And they're not about to go on their own, Katie. They're going to always find partners that will work with them. And so they have to get this right, but we have to give them the space to get it right. Even if they put out statements that we're not crazy about, we have to help them quietly and properly and privately get it right. And I'm convinced that those leaders know that Iran is a threat to them as well. And so they want to get this right, too.
President Nixon had 4 pillars for peace, and they fit quite well into the Abraham Accords: military power, economic power, hard-headed diplomacy, and ideological power.
The hard-headed part I can do. Yeah, I got that. Susan would tell you that. I can do hard-headed.
So one question on the Abraham Accords, and then 2 more, and then we're going to switch regions in the world. The Saudi statement on what happened in Israel was one of those statements that did not sit well publicly. Are they behind the scenes negotiating or doing things differently given what's been negotiated up to this point in getting them into some kind of normalization with Israel? And it seems to me that the best thing for them to do would to be continuing forward with their relationship given the barbarity that we saw, and that it would send a message that they don't want to be associated with that kind of behavior in the Middle East, and therefore they were going to be on the side of normalcy in the region. So I wanted to get your perspective on the statements they've been putting out, and also if they're moving forward with that. normalization?
So I don't know the answer to the second question for today. I don't know if there's still. I've heard different reports that this has stopped or the conversations are ongoing. I don't have any inside knowledge on that. But I do have an observation which I think will prove true over time. I am convinced that Mohammed bin Salman desperately understands that the right thing to do is to be on the right side of modernity, and he is working his tail off to get his country there. If you're a 12-year-old girl in the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, it is my judgment you should pray each day in a different way than I would pray as a Christian. But you should pray each day that Mohammed bin Salman is successful in his project. And Katie, if you believe that, which I do, then they'll find a way with Israel. As will, by the way, it's not even just the Middle East. We were working on big Muslim countries in Asia as well. We always think about Muslim, everybody's mind turns to the Middle East. The largest Islamic states in the world aren't in the Middle East. They are in Asia, Southeast Asia, and we were working there too. We want every country to recognize this rightful homeland of the Jewish people. And I'm convinced that the Gulf Arab states can see that. It is a bumpy road. October 7th made it even more complex for them, and American posture towards them has not been helpful as well.
So speaking to some folks around the room tonight, the questions that I've been getting asked are about the riots we're now seeing outside of U.S. embassies in the Middle East, Baghdad, Lebanon, elsewhere. Also questions about what we're seeing here in the cities in the United States, where we are seeing thousands of people, maybe hundreds in some places, but a lot of people, flying Palestinian flags alongside Hamas flags inside American cities, chanting things like "Gas the Jews," "We want Jewish genocide," and "Death to America." So what would you say to people who are concerned about that aspect of safety, not only of our diplomats overseas, but how we have this ideology, not just at our universities, but inside cities all over the country?
Anti-Semitism has been here for an awfully long time. Sometimes it lurks a bit beneath the surface, and then there's days when you see them in the streets with a Hamas flag. In America, we have a high tolerance for capacity for people to speak freely. Sometimes not for some ideas that I have, but for most ideas. We allow people to speak freely. I'm untroubled by that as a national policy perspective. I am deeply troubled by the scale of the absence of humanity of the people who could march in the streets with a Palestinian flag when Israeli mothers are still bearing their children and sitting Shiva. It is incomprehensible to me, as an individual, it's incomprehensible to me. I do worry about our embassies. Robert talked about this. I was incredibly blessed. God was definitely watching. I did not have a single CIA officer or a single one of my officials at the State Department killed while I was serving. And it's not because we were not doing hard things. We were out doing difficult things. We were definitely lucky. It always takes some good fortune. But when we took risk, we were prepared. Our embassy in Baghdad, there were nights I was kind of hoping they'd come over the wall just to watch the firepower come from inside to outside. Right? We understood that we were not going to let Tehran happen in Baghdad. We were having artillery rounds fired at our embassy nearly every night, and Robert and Secretary Esper and General McKenzie, we literally, I'm not sure what my State Department guys would have done, but the DOD guys there were ready. That's not braggadocious. It's not about being tough. It was about, we not only were ready, we told the leadership there in Iraq, we are ready. And let me tell you what the line is. Fingernail over the wall. Do not be in the vicinity. It'll end badly for you, right? And so we demonstrated that, here's the line. Here are the things we're going to protect our people. And so when I saw what's going on in Beirut last night, it reminded me. I've been to that embassy. One of my favorite cities in the whole world is Beirut. Susan and I just both love it. Huge Lebanese population in Wichita, Kansas. But I know the history of our embassy there. And I don't think for a moment President Biden and his team are prepared to do the things one needs to do to protect their own people, our own team that is risking their life there. There'll be all kinds of State Department officials. There'll be Department of Defense people. There'll be people from other agencies, U.S. agencies. There'll be lots of locals, lots of Lebanese locals that are working there as well. You have this responsibility to get that right. and we need to do the same thing in cities across America. Fine, you want to walk in the street, get a permit. We have rules for how to do this. You break something, we're coming for you, right? And if we do that, it'll be in the finest of the American tradition, which is we protect First Amendment freedoms, and then we use every law enforcement tool we can to shut these things down.
Okay. Let's move north up to Russia and Ukraine.
I'm going to have to run for mayor.
I think people would like a higher office than that for you, but
too hard. I'm far more popular in places other than the United States.
I think there's a place down on Pennsylvania Avenue people wish that you would run for, but that's just another topic.
So just so you know, LaMarie, you'll appreciate this. Robert's wife and LaMarie and my wife are good friends. My wife told me the other day, she said, just remember 5 more elections before you're President Biden's age. So,
Indeed.
So, patience, yes.
So give us an update on the Russia-Ukraine war. There's debate in Washington, D.C., but also among Americans about the money we're spending there. There are legitimate questions about corruption in Ukraine. What are the stakes as people get antsy about continuing the funding for Ukraine? And what expectations do you have for President Zelensky to restore some confidence in people who have been very supportive of his efforts, especially given that many would say President Biden has been too slow in offering what they need? The status there.
Yeah, so let me try and do the on the ground there first, and I'll talk about the U.S. domestic political piece of this. So on the ground, I try to follow it as closely as I can. Very little movement. My team showed me a quote of mine from exactly a year ago yesterday where I said, I predict in a year there'll be almost no movement. I got it right, sadly. Frankly, if you ask me today, in a year, I suspect it's likely you'll see a little more movement. It is pretty locked in, frozen up. Describe it how you will. I hope that we will continue to provide the Ukrainians, we, collectively the West, NATO, and the United States, will provide them the tools they need to do that. Because it's not so we should do it for the Ukrainian people, we should do it for Ukrainian sovereignty, but we should do it for us. And this now turns to the U.S. domestic piece of this. There are many in the Republican Party who think, we ought not be there. They cite Ukraine as corrupt. Fair enough. Put them in a long line of countries that have that problem. And we should be careful. What's the old thing about glass houses and stones or whatever it is? Be a little cautious.
His name is Hunter Biden.
Yes, exactly. We should be a little careful. So it's problematic, and we should make sure we know where every dollar goes. That is intensely reasonable. Those are all fair. But a Putin that believes that he can take sovereign territory through aggression, or is sitting in Kyiv, or, God forbid, a Baltic nation capital one day, or Moldova, that's bad for you. And it's bad for every American. It presents a staggering risk. This is how you truly do get to where we were in World War II, where we were unprepared to push back against naked aggressors who were prepared to do horrible things in the name of some historical thing that they believed had happened to them. We're better than that in the West. Those of us who believe in human dignity, property rights, we're capable of doing that. They haven't asked for any of our guys and gals yet. They just asked for stuff. We should have given them stuff in September of 21 when we realized this was going to happen. And instead, we kind of slow-rolled it. It put the Ukrainians in a bad spot. But we have a responsibility to get this right. And maybe this is I'll give you the Richard Nixon version of this because I think it's appropriate for this evening. It is an enormous burden to be an American. We bear a heavy load. Someone who served as a young soldier, who patrolled the East German border back in the Cold War, it's a lot to ask of the young men and women who were out there every day. We didn't pay them very much. They were taking some risk. The folks who fought in Afghanistan and Iraq took a ton more risk than we did. But that responsibility, that burden, is glorious. And we benefit it far more than the burden it taxes upon us. The fact that the world looks up to us, the fact that we are so prosperous, so free, is a direct result of our willingness not to send the 82nd Airborne everywhere and always. We didn't even do that in 4 years You think of it, you can't identify a large troop deployment in 4 years, and yet there were no wars. Because we understood American greatness and how we project power for our friends, our friends in Japan, our friends in South Korea, our friends in Australia to help against the Chinese threat, and our friends in Europe, who often don't do as much as they should, but for whom, when we do show up, it encourages them, it provides them a backbone that they need, and we're better off for it ourselves as well. And I fundamentally believe that. Last thing, I've gone on too long on this, but this is a central idea. One of the reasons that America is torn about what's happening in Ukraine today, and Americans and some in our party aren't prepared to support it, is because President Biden's never explained why it matters. He has not yet, now 2 years in, gone to the Oval Office, 9 p.m. Eastern, looked the American people in the eye and explained why this matters to them. And that is the responsibility of leaders to do, because when they do that, members of Congress, county commissioners, city council people, teachers, people all across America will go, my president just explained why this matters to me and to my family and to my grandchildren. Instead, when you just wander off to the helicopter and take the short stairs up to the plane, the American people just are left in doubt about what it is they're doing and why there is and what's the objective. And when you put them in that place, the American people will ask hard questions, and you have a duty to answer them.
You mentioned President Nixon's approach, and he used to say about America and its role in the world, if not us, then who? And that we cannot withdraw from the world. One country that wants us to withdraw from the world and that would like to become the #1 superpower is China. China obviously has a lot of ambitions. People also have doubts about China. I went to China in 2017 and saw the miles and miles of empty buildings that they said were bolstering their GDP, and then now they've blown them up because nobody lives in them. So give us a view of the Chinese threat and its clarity, but also some of the weaknesses that China may have that we can exploit and take advantage of.
Sure. That's about an 8-hour exercise, so I'll try to do it. I'll try to do it in 80 seconds. Yes. Of all the things that we'll talk about tonight, there are really only actually 2 things that can change our republic, and they are embodied in Xi Jinping and Randy Weingarten. One is if we don't teach our kids about American greatness and our place in the world, the 77th Secretary of State, the 78th Secretary would be hopeless. Right, when entire classes in school districts across America can't read at the reading level for 11th graders, like Xi Jinping salivates at that. And so I'm mindful for everyone in this room tonight, make sure your kids are learning stuff that matters, because if we don't, everything we've talked about tonight, Katie, is just all fancy hogwash, because we won't actually do what's needed. The second person that can change your life is Xi Jinping, and that of your grandchildren. They have 1.4 billion people, a powerful navy, a capable space organization. They probably run the largest disinformation campaign ever conducted in civilization. And by the way, they've been at war with us for 40 years economically. Well, I hear people say, Mike, you're going to cause a war with China. Hey, folks, they think we're in one. They are preparing for one kinetically, and they have been in one economically, and we've just turned the other cheek for an awfully long time. We encouraged all of the things that grew the Chinese economy at the expense of American workers. And so we began in the Trump administration, and we only began to turn that, to recognize that the Nixon-Kissinger doctrine from 1972 made sense then, but no longer does. And so we know how to push back against this. China's got lots of challenges. It's got demographic challenges. It has the near-term economic challenges you identified. I hope none of you own Chinese real estate bonds. They trade like a nickel on the dollar. So they've got economic challenges, but Xi Jinping is going to do his best to blow through those and prioritize creating hard power to, in his view, build out hegemony sufficiently that they can go essentially create a set of conditions where everyone will have to pay tribute to China. That's the model. That's the ancient Chinese model. And I think we can all figure out how not to get there. It's just going to take Americans that are prepared to do it. The Biden administration, I give them credit for continuing to recognize the threat, but they lead with the wrong foot. So who was the first American to travel to China from the administration? Just a little bit of history, it'd be the Secretary of Defense or the Secretary of State. It was the climate czar. Right? So John Kerry's the first senior American to go see Xi Jinping. Like he's like going, yeah, come on, man. Sure, I'll close a coal-fired power plant. Yeah, you betcha. Right, those are the things that Xi Jinping notices, and to my mind, he's got lots of challenges, but he's watching what's taking place in the world. I'm confident he thinks that as I think about exerting further influence, I now have doors that are open that I was praying would one day open, and he feels like this window is likely upon him.
So as we know, the Chinese plan for 100 years out, Americans plan for their next tweet. Unfortunately, what is your view of the long game here when it comes to China, especially given the current political environment in the United States?
Oh, we're going to crush them. Okay. I mean, look, we have the system look, our system works. Like, centralized planning is an epic fail. And it may feel good for moments, and it may even work in short and medium terms. But if we do this right and demand that they compete on a playing field that is even remotely close to level, our model, our innovative technology model, we'll crush them. I'm convinced of that. But what you can't do is you can't have such asymmetry that allows their model to run along at full speed for so long that you can't get on top of it. And so, 360,000 Chinese students studying in our universities today, 11,000 Americans studying in Chinese universities. I wrote this story in my book. They have infiltrated our university system at a scale that is unimaginable. When you see people with Hamas flags, I promise you the flags were made in China, and it wouldn't surprise me but what the Chinese Confucius Institutes were telling these kids, go out, you have the freedom to protest, urging them on. When Xi Jinping talks about American decline, he is not being observational, he's being directive. They are seeking to undermine our republic. We closed, when Robert and I were in office, we closed the largest spy ring in the history of America, I believe. And it was being run out of the Chinese consulate in Houston, Texas. Actually, one of the great joys of my time as Secretary of State was calling the Chinese ambassador to my office. You don't get much joy like that. I got to bring 3 hostages home from North Korea and then call the Chinese guy in. And I said to him, we need to be out of your consulate in 72 hours. And of course, he's furious. And then within, I think it was 2.5 hours, I'm watching TV, and the reports from the local TV stations in Houston, Texas, are that the Chinese consulate is on fire.
Burning started pretty quickly.
The burning began very quickly. Don't permit that asymmetry to take place. Our diplomats in China can't move out of the building without a minder, and yet we let them roam freely amongst us. So we have different models, but those are the kind of asymmetries at the tactical and operational level that if you fix them, you begin to create space where Xi Jinping's got many, many harder decisions to make than the ones that he has faced for 8 or 10 years.
I think, too, that a lot of these countries that China has tried to get into their camp by giving them roads and bridges that collapse within a year and not hiring their workers, and in the aftermath of COVID, that people are starting to see through what the Chinese government is offering as fake diplomacy to try and rope people into debt.
I think that's true. By the way, here's another piece of evidence. The Chinese don't have a problem with illegal immigration across their southern border. Like, who wants to go to China? Like, is anybody going, man, if I could just get to Beijing?
Yeah.
Like,
yeah. Well, they did build a wall a long time ago.
It's sign me up. It reminds me too, Katie, that, Putin always talks about how the fact these people, the folks in Ukraine want to be Russian. I have not seen anybody fleeing to Moscow.
Yeah. Not sure that's true.
It's just be mindful of your blue passport and the power that it gives to you and the privilege that it gives to you and the duty that imposes upon us as well.
One final question. We have a presidential election underway. It's about a year out. It is October. November is very soon, 2 weeks. Why should Americans care about foreign policy in the election, given their choices and the future not only of the country and the world, especially given how things have changed drastically over the past 2 weeks?
If history is a guide, it won't be foreign policy per se that drives how people think about who they're going to support in the election. Although it could be the fact that there are at least two major conflagrations going on will change that dynamic for this election cycle, especially here in primary season, where it'll be fresh for everyone. But my actual thought, if you said, well, why, is we draw these lines between things that are foreign and things that are domestic, but my reality as a practitioner was that it was never that way. I was working with the Department of Commerce on how it is we're going to prevent the Chinese from stealing our semiconductor technology, and I was working with DHS along our southern border to deliver a set of policies that would keep us safer. The connectivity is real, and the things that happen around the world, especially with a global economy that moves as fast as ours, they impact people all across the country really fast. When you make a decision, as President Trump did, to put tariffs on China, my phone lit up from my friends back in Kansas who are farmers saying, what the blank are you doing? And I, of course, bravely, when I'd get those notes from my farmer friends, like, what are you doing? I'd say, call Secretary of Agriculture. Then I'd turn my phone off. But this, I think people can now see that the demarcation is not as clear. It's not that there is a bucket of domestic and a bucket of foreign. We now live in a world where things that happen in Kyiv or things that happen in the deserts of Israel impact each and every one of us. And I hope that's the case, because we do have to get this right so that we can live in this free and special place.
Well, as we know, if China starts stopping the shipping lanes in the South China Sea, life for Americans will be very, very difficult and much different.
And very quickly. Yes, very quickly.
Well, thank you, Mr. Secretary, for your time tonight. Thank you, everyone, for being here, and have a wonderful summit.
Secretary Pompeo, Katie Pavlich, thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you. And we will see you tomorrow. Have a good evening.